Only hearing those lectures which I have been giving on Zoom, so I have not been able to contact you. So today's lecture is based on this book. We have so far done with the history of languages and how the Indo-European languages and others were, researched upon and their families were determined. The most important language for us, at least one of the most important for northern India and Pakistan, is Urdu. Therefore, I'll give you something which will sort of contradict and change and open to question some of the myths we have about Urdu. So now let's come to the today's lecture, which is on myths and realities about Urdu. You must have heard about these myths. I'm sure the books which you have been reading are full of these kind of myths. Let me look at the myths. Then we will see in the end whether we can refute them or accept them or change them. One is that Urdu is a military language, as its name, which means military camp in Turkish, indicates. It is the name which your books give is Askari Zuban. True or not? It is true. Askari Zuban it is called. Well, we are going to come to that. The next myth is that Urdu is a mixed language, and the word they have used for it is Khichdi Zuban. Khichdi, like it's mixed, It's a kind of that's a pidgin language. So I'll define what a pidgin language is, and then we are going to discuss whether it comes out as a pidgin language or an ordinary language like English and French. The third myth is that Urdu was born when Muslims interacted with Hindus during Akbar's rule. Now Akbar's rule is between 1556 and 1605. That means this is the 1556 is the 16th century, middle of the 16th century. I will prove to you that there are documents which I have seen which are older than that. So this myth we will discuss. Fourth myth is that Urdu was born in areas now in Pakistan. Hence it is a language of the Indus Valley, not the Gangetic Valley. This myth also we will look at. This is a Pakistani nationalist myth. It is a little older than the birth of Pakistan itself, but nevertheless, it is a myth which many people have promoted. Okay, that it's a Pakistani language and not an Indian language. It's a language of the Indus Valley and not the language of the Ganges Valley, the valley of the Ganges. So this is a myth we are going to explore. The fifth one is that Urdu is a Muslim language, that it is, Hindi is a Hindu language and Urdu is a Muslim language. It is associated with Islam and has words of Arabic and Persian, and it is written in the variant of the Arabic script. Therefore, it is said that this is a Muslim language. That we will see. Okay. And the last myth is that the British and the Hindus harmed Urdu. The British and the Hindus harmed Urdu. Have you seen variants of this myth in your own books? That Urdu was harmed by the British and the Hindus? Have you seen that written somewhere? You have? In your history books. Okay. So we are going to talk about this one also. Let's come to the first myth. Myth number one, that Urdu is a military language, and they say that the name of this is, in Turkish, it means a military camp. Well, the fact is, yes, this is what the name means, but this does not mean that actually it is a military language too, despite its name. The reason for that is that the word, it's a Turkish word, all right, military camp, but Urdu. But the word was used in India not only for a military camp, but for the king's court, where the king lived. I will now come to the different names Urdu has had. to show that it is Urdu is actually one of the last names, actually their last name of the language. There were names for the ancestor of this language earlier. It was called Hindi from the 13th to the 19th century. That means most of the time which we study this language, the ancestor of our language, both actually Urdu Hindi, both Urdu and Hindi was simply called Hindi. It was also called Dehlavi in the 13th, 14th century. Amir Khusro has used the word Dehlavi for it. It was also called Hindvi and Hindui, but that's just a variant of the noun Hindi. In Gujarat, you will be surprised to find, Indian Gujarat, it was called Gujri, and that's very strange, but it was. So it was. There is a separate Gojri language, as we know, but this was a word specially used in Indian Gujarat for Urdu. We have got poetry from that, which is, of course, you can recognize it as the poetry in the ancestor of Urdu Hindi. It was called Dakhni in the Deccan, Hyderabad and the surrounding areas, etc. And there it was associated with that region, and again there is poetry in it, etc. So we can know that this is the ancestor of Urdu Hindi. Now, why should it be called Gujri or Dakhni? Can you think of a reason why the ancestor of this language should be called Dakhni or Gujri? Anyone who can give me a guess?
Maybe it's introduced by the Lord of Deccan. According to his name, it's Dakhni.
No, not the Lord of Deccan. It was introduced there because the people who went there from Delhi, the commanders of the armies, the administrators, the merchants, the ulama, these people were all from North India, Delhi area, etc. So they spoke a variant of the ancestor of this language. Over there, when they settled in that region, they started calling it Gujri or Dakhni, right? So that is why. Some of the British officers here also called it Indostan, language of Hindustan. So they called it this also. This is again, but this is for a short time, Indostan. All of them have associations and ideological biases. You can see Hindi, the ideological bias nowadays would be Indianness, because it is now used for modern Hindi. And Dehlavi is about a particular region, and so on and so forth. Now look at the next one. You will be surprised to know that it was called Moors also for some time. Moors is, the Muslims of Spain were called Moors, but in India some of the British officers from outside called the language of the broken language of their servants, so to speak, they called it Moors. The British, however, generally called it Hindustani, written in three scripts actually. One was the same script which we use today for Urdu, the other one was the Devanagari script which is used for Hindi, and the third was the Roman script which is used to write English. So the British used it in three languages. They actually published newspapers and hymns and the Bible in it. That we will talk about later. Ghalib, etc. calls it Rekhta, which means actually mixed and actually substandard, because the assumption is that Persian is the standard language and India's local languages are inferior. So Urdu is not the first name. It is actually a name which comes up much later. It comes up in the 18th century. What does Babur call it? He is an outsider. Well, this is a quote from Babur's own words in Tuske Babari, which is written in Turkish. And Babur uses the word Hindustani for some language, but I'm not sure, nobody is, that this language is the ancestor of Urdu Hindi, because all the outsiders called all languages, as soon as they entered from the Khyber Pass, this was Hindustan for them. So the language of Peshawar they called Hindko, right? It is in the city, even now Hindko is used. Hind and Ko is language. So whether Babur called it for some ancestor of Punjabi or Hindko, I don't know. Nobody knows. But he did use the word Hindustani. So the British are not the only ones. All foreigners use the word Hindustani or Hindi for the languages of India. How do we know that in India the word which I just told you about, Urdu, was not used for a military camp? Well, let's look at some poetry from that area. Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu is a Persian poet writing in India, and he says, "Pas ba tahqiq pevast ke afsa zuban ha zuban Urdu ast or Farsi hamija muad parast." You understand a little bit of Persian? If not, I've given a translation. Therefore, research shows that the most authentic or sophisticated among all the languages is the language of the city, and the Persian of this place is the most authentic. Now, why Persian? He's talking about Urdu, but he's not. He's actually talking about Iranian poets, and he's talking about Persian, which they use. So what he's saying is that he is talking that the Farsi Hamija Modbarast, Zuban Urdu ast, language of the city, sophisticated city, the king's city. That is the best language, he says. So you see, he's using it. He lives in India. He's using the word Urdu for the king's city. Let's look at. He also points out that all the classical poets were associated with a certain city and spoke the language of that city. Bahama Zubane Muqarrar harf zadan o anist magar Zubane Urdu illa mashallah kama sabak. What they spoke, harf zadan, and then he says that language is o anist magar Zubane Urdu. That is no other than the language of the city. In other words, village languages are inferior, and here you can see that it's nothing to do with the ancestor of our language. It's simply the Persian of the city, or any other language of the city. Which city? The king's city, sophisticated city. So what happened? Well, in Agra, the king's court, the Mughal king's court was at Agra. And the language around that was actually Barj Bhasha. What happened was that inside the court, etc., a very Persianized form of the North Indian language, probably Khadi Boli, was used. And then in Shah Jahanabad, Delhi, Shah Jahanabad is the name of Delhi, again in the king's court, the language which was used was a highly Persianized form of the local, of the Khadi Boli Hindi. So that is the language of the city, and it used to be called Zubane Urdu-e Mualla, language of the exalted city, which shrank to language of the city, Zubane Urdu, and then Zuban also was lopped off and it became Urdu. So this has got nothing to do with military camps. It's simply an evolution of names, and the name which has been used for this language more than any other is Hindi. Right. So this is completely wrong myth that it's a language associated with military camps and so on and so forth. Completely wrong.
But sir, when we talk about military, so definitely the soldier from come into the military. So can we say this myth could be right if the people from different regions and cities come and sit together in military camp, and the language start from pidgin and then move on?
No, but it didn't. Because we will come to it later. Merchants also come from different areas. Preachers also come from different areas. And so there are many people who come and mix up in different regions and do different, not just soldiers. These people got mistaken because of the Turkish word which is used for a military camp. Otherwise, this is not true. Actually, most people mix in the bazaars and as merchants, etc. So this myth is entirely wrong. Let's look at myth number 2, which is Urdu is a mixed language, Khichdi Zuban. Now, Khichdi Zaban implies that it's not a real language. It's just you take a little bit of this and you take a little bit of that, you mix them together, and it becomes, it doesn't have any rules of its own. It doesn't have a phonological system of, consonants and vowels and so on. Now, look at this one. What is a pidgin? A pidgin is a simplified version of a language that develops as a means of communication between two or more groups that do not have a language in common. Fundamentally, a pidgin is a simplified means of linguistic communication as it is considered impromptu or by convention between individuals or groups of people. A pidgin is not the native language of any speech community, is instead learned as a second language. So remember, the ancestor of this language, a natural language is people's mother tongue. A pidgin is something which is nobody's mother tongue to begin with. If they have children and they still speak that, that's called a creole. It's a reduced language. It has the grammar and everything else. It's, you pick up from there, you pick up from there, etc. It has no system unless it's, of course, picked up from somewhere else and mixed up. Urdu is not that. Urdu is an Indian language, like any other natural Indian language. And slowly it picked up a vocabulary of Persian and Arabic because those were the people who came from outside. It also picked up European words later, and that happens to all languages. Let's look at the composition of Urdu. This is only in 1,000 words, and it is by someone called Maria Isabel Maldonado Garcia. She wrote a book on the density of Urdu, by which she means what is the composition of Urdu. And she says that in these 1,000 words which she has, 1,000 is a very small data set, but anyway, in those 1,000, Arabic is 29.90%, Sanskrit is 26.90%, Persian is 21.7%, Khadi Boli Hindi is 7.20%, English is 7.80%, English, etc. means English, Portuguese, and other European languages. That's what it means. It doesn't mean just English. Prakrits are the other local languages, and those are 6.40%. Languages of uncertain origin, 0.40%. You might say, well, it has a lot of Persian and Arabic in vocabulary. But we do not classify a language by vocabulary alone. We classify it by its sound system, by its grammar, by its phonology, and a number of other things. Vocabulary keeps changing, and vocabulary is secondary. That is why we consider Urdu a natural language and not something like a pidgin language. And if you are surprised at the number of words from outside, you shouldn't be, because that's what history does. Now look at that. The composition of English. Urdu had more than this. Anglo-Saxon word stock is only 30%, which is Germanic, and the Latin and Norman French and Greek is 70%. So it's even more than Urdu. Words from foreign sources. Because English, the small Germanic language which was in Great Britain, I mean the Angles came and settled there, they called it England, and the other Germanic tribes came and settled over there. Then the Norman French conquered it in 1066, Common Era. Duke William of Normandy in the Battle of Hastings conquered England. And the Norman French, his nobles, etc., they spoke Norman French. And Latin was the language of the church and of learned people, so Latin also came in. And of course Greek was a learned language which had come into Latin in which philosophy and science and everything came to be written also. So Greek and Latin all came in via French, Norman French. So 70%, look at that, that's pretty high. And yet nobody says that English is a Khichdi Zaban. I don't know if you have read Chaucer. Chaucer is 1340 to 1400, the poet Chaucer. You have read Chaucer? Well, look at this. And small ye foolies makan melodie, that slept in all the night with open ear. This is Chaucer. When that April with the shores is soot, the drocht of March has persed to the root, and bathed every vein in switched liquor, of which virtue engenders is the fluid. And Zafira sake with the Sogit Bagrit, in spirit hath in every halt and heath, the Tandre Croppies in the youngest son, hath in the Ram his course Hafiron. You know? So it is not very easily understandable, although it is from 1340 to 1400. Urdu from that period, ancestor of Urdu, Hindi, is more easily comprehensible, and yet English is called a natural language and Urdu is called a mixed language. This is an obvious bias, and Mir Amman and such kind of people have propagated it. They didn't know what they were saying because they had done no original research. They were literary people. Next. Composition of English once again, just a moment, sir. 80% entries in any English dictionary are borrowed, mainly from Latin. 80%, that's quite a lot. Over 60% of all English words have Greek or Latin roots. In the vocabulary of the sciences and technology, the figure rises to over 90%. Only 10% are Germanic words. Look at the word mutton. You know what mutton is? It's the flesh of? No, not lamb. Lamb is a different word. Mutton is the flesh of sheep. Right? Lamb is this younger animal, smaller animal. Okay. Why? Because in French, sheep are called moutons. So the person who is eating it calls it in French is mutton. The person who is actually looking after the animal in the field is Saxon, and he doesn't call it mouton. He calls it sheep. Germanic word, right? So it is like this. And by the way, goat meat, which we eat, we call it mutton, but that's not mutton, that's goat meat. The word in English wouldn't be mutton for it. It would be not lamb. It would be goat meat. They don't eat goat that much, so this is the word for it, goat meat. So this is entirely wrong. I go to myth number 3, and that is Urdu was born when Muslims interacted with Hindus during Akbar's rule, and I've given you the dates of Akbar's rule. Well, let me just tell you about okay, but you are listening to me anyway, and it doesn't matter if you have these things on your phone. The slides, you can see them. So this is about the age of Urdu, but then that's going to waste a lot of time. No, don't do it. That's going to waste a lot of time. I will explain to you. Now you don't know the Devanagari script, so I will take it for granted that whatever I read from the Devanagari script is correct. The first text I have is Basti na suniye na basti, agam agochar aisa. Basti na suniye na basti, agam agochar aisa, gagan si. I'll not read the whole thing. I'll just give you the words which you can understand. Look at the words. There are 23 words. There are just 2 lines out of 67 total words. And these are Basti, Aisa, Naam, Ge, Dharoge, Kaisa, Rakhi, Chad, Mount, Pia, drank, Pia, Pani Pia, and so on. Sab, Sang, Hua, Bujhe, Vichar, Sochna, Shabd, word, Karan, for which reason. All these are words which you can easily understand. Now, this is a religious text. A religious text means that there has to be much more Sanskrit element in it. And yet, most of it is intelligible, as much as Chaucer is perhaps a little less than Chaucer because it's a religious text, but nevertheless it is intelligible, easily intelligible. Or rather, it may not be intelligible as a whole, but you can recognize the words in it, etc. And this is one of the oldest forms. This is called Gorakh Bani. It is said to come from the 12th century, but this date is probably wrong. The person who has written it, between Hindus and Muslims as to which script and which language is earlier, so the supporters of Hindi came up with this, that Gorakh Bani is earlier. But see, it has the book, it has the word kitabs in it. Now kitab is from Arabic. So this date is probably wrong, because if in North India, it was the Turks who came here, Mahmud of Ghazna, etc. So it's probably not that early. Actual writing comes later. So even if it is not that early, even then it is from the 13th century, if not the 12th century, 13th century, maybe 14th century, but nevertheless it is there. Here is another, again in the Devanagari script, and this is Janana mein, Thora, Vansra. This is a court order. He is saying that you can go to the harem where women are kept, etc. And he is giving an order. And it's, you will not understand all of it, but you can understand most of it. Pradhan barobar karan devega. Your room will be near our secretary's room. So these are texts in a script which you don't know. I had to read the script in order to write this book, so I retain the script. But there is another script which you know very well, which is the same as the Urdu script. And in that there is Persian. Again, it's a language which you may not know very well, but you can understand. This is from a Persian script which is from the 14th century. And shall I bring Nihari? He said, wait a little. So this is a Sufi talking to a maid servant. And the servant says, shall I bring Nihari? I have translated it into English. The Sufi said, wait a little. This he said in the Hindi language, use the word. Reh. Acha, look at the Persian. It says, Nihari biaram. Gufti bari sabar kun. In sukhan bazubane Hindvi. Farmadan ki gufti kalma reh. Sufi is talking to his servant, and the servant doesn't know Persian. So he says that he is using what the writers calls Zubane Hindi. Farmudan. And what does he say? Reh, ther. Here is in the same source, Tu mera gusai, tu mera kartar, muj is tap thi choda. You are my Lord, you are the one who does everything, save me from this fever. And the Persian source makes it clear that this was said in Hindi and was written as such. What does the Persian source say? Pay attention. It says, "In alfaz bazubane Hindi farmudan, hama chuna nabishta shud." These words were said in the Hindi language, usi tarah likh diye gaye, and were written in the same way. So here is another proof that this is 14th century. Akbar sits on the throne in the 16th century. So 200 years earlier, there were people who were, small sentences from their language are being given, and these people are speaking to servants and others in the ancestor of like Urdu Hindi. And here is Ali Maula, who says about the young Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia is a young child. He is praying in some place, and he says, Ali Maula is another man. He says, "Are Maulana, ye Buddha hosi." You understand this very well. This is used in Punjabi even now. Buddha hosi. And then he goes on to say something else. He says, "Man dar do cheez mi bina." I have seen two things in him. Yaki ast ke bazubane Hindvi guftan. One is, and he said in the Hindi language, "Jo mundasa bandhe, so paye pasre." Jo pagdi bandta, wo paon ke upar padta hai. That means a person with greatness is humble. And he sees this in the young Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia. Right? And this is written 200 years before they say that language was born. So this is not true. Okay. I bring another proof for you. This is Khairul Bayan by Yazid Ansari, and 1524 to 1585. This is Akbar's time. But the language has spread so much that Yazid Ansari writes a book in order to create a new religion. And in this book, he uses this script and these words. I've got the exact script and words from the manuscript which is in the University of Tübingen and also in the Pashto Academy. रे बायजीद लिख किताब के आगाज़ के बयान जिनके सारे अक्खर सहन बिस्मिल्लाह तमाम मैं न गवाऊँगा मजदूरी उन्हनि की जे लिखें पढ़न बिगाड़न यानी विदाउट चेंजिंग अक्खर कि तुम कहीं पढ़न लिखें इस कारण जे सही होए बयान. All this is written etc. in this script where in Kunigram in Waziristan. Here is a man who is writing in 4 languages. He writes the first book of Pashto because he uses the Pashto language. He writes Persian, he writes Arabic, and he writes what he calls Zubane-Hindi. So this is what was called Hindi. It was so widespread at that time, it couldn't have been born at that time. So myth number 4, Urdu was born in areas now in Pakistan, hence it's a language of the Indus Valley, not the Gangetic Valley. This is simply a battle of origins between Pakistani Muslims and scholars and Hindu scholars. And of course, many Muslim scholars too used to say that this is Masood Hussain Khan, for instance, and he never agreed with this. But there were many people. A very careful researcher, Hafiz Mahmud Shirani, who said that Urdu was born in the Punjab, and his book is called Punjab Mein Urdu. He argues that, you see, the Turks first came and settled down and ruled for 300 years. Mahmud Ghaznavi and his sons, etc., kept ruling in Lahore. Their capital was Lahore. So it stands to reason that Urdu was born here. He doesn't consider that modern Punjabi is different from ancient Punjabi. And modern Punjabi has also the same words of Arabic and Persian origin. If you analyze the words, etc., they are intelligible with Urdu and they come from Persian and Arabic also. So, but he is keen to prove, he was one of the, before Pakistan, but he was keen on the Pakistan movement, so he supported the idea that this language is from this area and Punjab. Acharya Ramchandra Shukla had the same problem, but he wanted to put everything in India. So he looked at the history, not of Urdu, but only of that Hindi which was written in the Devanagari script. He ignored that which was written in the Arabic script. Muslim scholars ignored that which was written in the Devanagari script, although some of them knew it very well, and yet they ignored each other. Masood Hussain Khan, on the other hand, wrote a book saying that yes, it was Urdu's ancestor was born in the Urdu Hindi's ancestor was born in the Delhi area, and this is probably Khadi Boli is the nearest dialect which got Persianized, although others also got Persianized, but this is probably the nearest dialect which got Persianized and is the, let's say, the parent of Urdu. Sayyid Sulaiman Nadwi, on the other hand, said no, the Muslims first came to Sindh and therefore Urdu was born in Sindh. His proofs are even less convincing, let's say, than Shirani's proofs. Because the Muslims who came to Sindh were Arabs. And the Arabic content might be 26%, etc., but there is other content, Persian content and so on others. So this is not very convincing. Theory of non-Sanskritic origin, this is advanced by a number of other scholars working in Pakistan. Rashid Akhtar Nadwi, Pakistan ka Qadeem Rasmul Khat or Zuban. He says that it's the Urdu's ancestors is a Dravidian language of this area. It is not an Aryan language at all. And since it is not an Aryan language, it is not a daughter of Sanskrit. Anul Haq Farid Koti, he traces Urdu back to the Munda and the Dravidian languages too, again ignoring the Sanskritic theory. Abdul Jamil Khan wrote a book called The Politics of Language, Urdu Hindi, an Artificial Divide, and he says that Urdu Hindi, but he talks about Hindi too, has Middle Eastern roots. It migrated from there, and that the civilization in the Indus Valley actually had a lot to do with migrations from the Middle East. So these are narratives of the ownership of Urdu, and they are colored not by scholarship but by nationalism. Personally, I agree with Masood Hussain Khan. Although I am a historian, I haven't done the kind of research which he has. He has compared Khadi Boli's words and the words of Urdu, etc. I haven't done that kind of research. But yet it does stand to reason that this is probably an Indian language which was born there, and words kept coming because the people who came were from, obviously they were Turks. They came and they spoke not Turkish, they were Turks in origin, but they actually used Persian. Persian was the language of the court of the Mughals, not Turkish. Turkish was never used by the Mughals in India. Although Babur wrote in it, but he wrote his poetry in Persian. Now we come to myth number 5, vocabulary which we have. It ignores the fact that the ancestor of Urdu Hindi did have a Sanskritic vernacular phase also. There was a time when the ancestor of Urdu Hindi was more in the tradition of Sanskritic verse and used Sanskritic vocabulary. Now this is Masnavi Jamil Jalbi edited, a great scholar of Urdu, edited this Masnavi Kadam Rao Padam Rao. And it says, Gusai tuhi ek duna jag adhar, barobar duna jag tuhi denahar, akash uncha, patal dharti tuhi, jahan kuch na koi tahan hai tuhi, jahan kuch na koi tahan hai tuhi. Which means, the last two lines means, you are the heaven and the lower part of the world, where there is nobody there, you exist. Jahan kuch na koi tahan hai tuhi. It's not that difficult to understand. And it's from the 14th century. Except that there is a lot of Sanskritic element in it. This was purged out. So it is true that Urdu came to be associated with Islam and Muslims in India, Muslim identity in India, but that's a later development. It's not always been like this. There was actually a movement which is called the movement of Tathir, which means purification by Muslims, but it was actually a language of change. All languages change, and this is deliberate language change. Language engineering, you can call it, meant for a certain purpose. And the purpose was that Muslims in India, North India I mean, were no longer proficient in Persian. Actually, the Persians made fun of them because they spoke with an Indian accent. Of course, they spoke with a local accent. They spoke like we speak English with the accent of our languages. They spoke Persian with the accent of their language, which was, of course, an ancestor of Urdu Hindi. So they wanted some identity symbol. Now they had lost political power, so they wanted some other kind of symbol. And when you lose political power, then you are clutching at straws. You want all kinds of symbols. So one of them was the clothes and the way you dress up, etc., and adab and so on and so forth. But they also wanted a language, obviously, and so they made Persianized Urdu, deliberately Persianizing it as their identity symbol. They did so many things. I've given some of them here. Sanskritic words were purged out. Words of local dialects were also purged out. In place of the above, words of Persian and Arabic were added. Literary and cultural allusions, metaphors and symbols would be predominantly to Iranian themes, Islamic cultures, as in Iran, etc. Allusions to Indian landscape were replaced by references to an idealized and conventionalized Iranian landscape. So the animal, the bird which came to be prominent was bulbul, and Bahar as the weather, as the season. There's not much of Bahar in India. Bahar is more in the northern areas. It's in Iran. Bahar is is an excellent season. But here the rainy season is actually, in India the rainy season is the equivalent of Bahar. But they don't talk about the rainy season. They don't talk about Sawan Bhadra except in songs. They talk about Bahar in the ghazal. So allusions to Indian landscape were replaced by this. And then there were conventions of love, how do you express love? So the Indian poetry had a woman who expressed love for the man. Ranja, Ranja karde main ap Ranja hui, he says. This is a convention of Tamil poetry also, this is a convention of North Indian poetry also, but not a Persian poetry. In Persian poetry, it is a man who expresses love, amorous desire, romance for the female, and not only female, actually female, but a figure which is between a boy and a girl. So that is what the Persian convention is, and to be addressed as he, that is used. That's a convention. Now this is very different from the Indian conventions. Okay, so all this changed. You will ask me for proof. How do I know? Well, it is actually written in Persian documents of that time. And the people who changed them, one of them is Shah Hatim. He wrote in his book Diwan Zadeh, which is the small diwan. He had a big diwan, diwan, collection of poetry. He made it smaller. So this is in 1756. In the preface of that, Dibacha, this is what he says. He is talking about his linguistic policies. Lisan-e Arabi और ज़ुबान फ़ारसी के क़रीबुल फ़हम और कसीरुल इस्तेमाल बाशद और रोज़मर्रा दिल्ली कि मिर्ज़ायान हिंद और फ़सीहान रिंद दर मुहावरा दारन मंजूर दाश्ता. What he says is that words out of the Arabic and Persian languages which are intelligible and commonly used, I have used, and the daily usage of Delhi with the gentlemen of India, and the correct use of the language and their idiom is acceptable to me. And then he says, Zubane har diyar taba hindvi ke ara bhaka goyand mawquf karda. The language of all various localities which are called the common language, Bhaka, I have stopped it. महज रोज़मर्रा के आम फ़हम और ख़ास पसंद बूद इख्तियार नमूदा. And the last thing is that I have adopted that language which is used in daily life and is popularly liked and also liked by the connoisseurs of the language. So he is actually given a program that I am going to take out the Sanskritic words, etc., and the words of common dialects, etc., and purge the language of them. I actually saw the words which were purged out. They were very difficult to find, but there are 3 volumes of that survived in Karachi University's, right below they had a place where these words were there. It was a list of 4,000 words. So Hatim, Nasikh from Lucknow and a number of others actually carried on this change, not for a short time, but for almost a century. So for identity reasons, the Muslim elite of India, the poets, actually changed and Persianized the language deliberately. Later on, from 1802 onwards, the Hindus did the same. Again for the similar reasons, for political reasons and reasons of finding an identity different from the Muslims. So your books tell you that the Hindus brought about this change and created this artificial language which is now called Hindi. Well, that is half true. The Muslims did it first, the Muslim elite poets did it first, the Hindu elite poets again did it later, both for similar reasons, both because they were in competition, both because they wanted an identity distinct from each other, right? Okay, the other Urdu Hindi, the Hindi experiment of using Sanskrit and Hindi was done in Fort William College, Lallu Ji, Lal Kavi, and so on. And these people did it. I have written on it separately. Other people have also written about it, but I'm not going to talk about it here. So Urdu as an Islamic language at this time, that is to say in the 19th century, rather from the end of the 18th century onwards, Urdu came to be more deliberately associated with Muslims and Islam. Shah Abdul Qadir Shah Rafiuddin translated the Quran into Urdu. Muradullah Ansari Assembly gives reasons for having written his Tafsir-e-Muradi in 1771, which ended. By the way, Assembly is a book I have seen, and he says that I have been requested by many people who want me to write in Hindi. Otherwise, Tafsir used to be written in Persian. So he says, at one place he says that God, separe ki tafsir Allah Ta'ala ne Hindi zuban mein tamam karwa di. Hindi zuban mein. He doesn't say Urdu, of course not. He uses the word Hindi for it, as do many other people at that time. I saw the translation of the Quran in Heidelberg, and that was, and a British officer had ordered that, and it was supposed to be in Hindi. It was never finished, but it was supposed to be in Hindi, and I found that this, by Hindi, of course, they meant the Urdu. Sharia guidebooks were written. You would be wondering what they are. Well, actually, in the 18th century, and 19th century, the British were getting very powerful. The ulama were most concerned about it. Why are the British getting powerful? What's happening? Why is our civilization in decay? And of course, as ulama normally do, they blamed Muslims for it. So they said they are not following the rituals of Islam. They are not following, the faith. That's why it is happening. But then they also reasoned that our writings are all in Persian and Arabic. Ordinary people don't know Persian and Arabic. So a movement began to write small pamphlets for people in the languages which they know, which means Punjabi and Pashto and Urdu in the Urdu belt, Urdu Hindi belt, and so on and so forth. So I'm only talking about the Urdu ones. Khurram Ali's Nasihatul Muslimin, Qurban Ali's Tuhfatul Mu'mineen, and Shariat Ka Lat. And you know how they are? They are in small, catchy little couplets, poetic couplets. Farz ghusl mein teen sambhal, pehle muh mein pani dal. And I have seen over 50 such books in the Lahore Museum in Punjabi. And I saw them in England also. I actually wrote an article upon them, the books in Punjabi and Pashto and Balochi. For Balochi I had to go to Balochistan and so on. So this is a movement all over India. Actually, Puthis are also in Bengal. So they're also, so it's not just North India, but also Bengal, up to Bengal. Muslims are writing this. Hindus are also writing something. We are not concerned with it right now, but they too were getting, as print was coming out, so religious books were being printed more. Two movements were going out side by side, secularism as well as, knowing religions more, written forms of religion, printed forms of religion. So the Muslim and the Hindu books were also came out because printing was something new. Urdu as an Islamic language also means that there was teaching and preaching in Urdu. Sects and subsects wrote and defined themselves. All these, the Barelvi subsect, the Deobandi subsect, the Ahl Hadith subsect, all of them were born during this time. And the madrasas started teaching instead of Persian. They started teaching in Urdu also. Munazaras were held, debates. You might not know it, but the munazara tradition is carried out in madrasas even now. And in that you bring a number of books, you choose a subject on which to argue, and there is someone who sits down to judge. You give your arguments quoting from the books you have brought, the other person gives arguments quoting from their books, etc. And then it is decided who wins. But all this requires that you would do it in some language. And the language chosen for the munazara was Urdu. Munazaras were held with Christians, and munazaras were held with each other within Islam. Munazaras were held all over the place. And the language was Urdu. Religious poetry was sung like Hamd and Naat and Tarif-e Pak and Jangnama and Karbala Nama and so on and so forth. Modern Sufi writings, which used to be in Persian, came to be written in Urdu. And Urdu became a symbol of Muslim identity in Pakistan when it was made. In India, Urdu is now used in the as in Indian Islam. It's a madrasa language too, and in Bangladesh also, it is very much known in the madrasas. This, I'm sure, what I've just told you, you may not have known the details, but you knew in general. But one thing in which your history books mislead you almost completely is that the British harmed Urdu. Completely. As far in the British, as far as Hindus are concerned, partly true, and the reasons for that I'll give you. Okay. The British actually used, they call it Hindustani of course, they actually were the first to officially use it in India for instruction and evaluation. They ordered their servants around in it, yes, and they learned to absorb many words in it. So there was code switching among old Indian hands. India hands means people who had lived in India, served as officers, and their men learnt it in the gentlemen, that is to say, officers of the Civil Service of India, ICS, and officers of the Army in India. They learnt it in various places. Fort William College is the first actually to have an Urdu department in order to teach Urdu. The British women, the ladies also learnt it, but they also learnt it only to order servants around. Children learnt it from ayahs and so on. And Hindustani was written in the Roman script for the use of the army and the church. As you know, a number of hymns are in Punjabi and Urdu, Christian hymns. And the newspaper during the war, Second World War, etc., was printed in the Roman script. And this was called, army orders were passed to soldiers in the Roman script. And that was called Roman Urdu, and army officers had to learn it. Even when Pakistan was made and India was made, for a long time, this was done, that the orders were passed from the adjutant was passed the order to the Subadar Major, or the Vardi Major, or the Risaldar Major, if it was an Armored Corps unit, and it was Saab Kal Hamne Darbar Karna Mangta. So that was all written in the Roman script, English script, etc. So the British actually promoted Urdu. They also promoted it because everyone needs jobs. And here is a proof, 1854. In a letter from the Secretary of the Local Committee of the Public Instruction to W. Moore, Secretary to the Government of the Northwestern Provinces. Northwestern Provinces is, by the way, what is called UP these days. Not the Northwest Frontier Province, but the Northwestern Provinces. Dated 10th February 1854. And he says that these are the following conditions for government employment in these provinces, UP area. First, the person who seeks a job should be able to read the ordinary Shakista handwriting, as the Urdu papers presented in the courts were in this, so it was a court language. Second, to translate from English to Urdu. Third, to write an order if the heads were told verbally in Urdu. Fourth, to write a clear, good and quick Shakista hand in Urdu. Without this, you can't get a job. So what would be the effect of this? That, you pass an order that you have to use Urdu. What would happen? Obviously, both the Hindus and the Muslims and the Sikhs also would have to learn Urdu in order to get jobs in the Punjab as well as the UP area. In other places, not so, because in Bengal the language of the courts was Bengali. In Sindh the language of courts was Sindhi, but in the Punjab it was Urdu. And Punjab is huge. You know, it starts from the Torkham border, Afghan border, and goes up to Delhi. That was the Punjab of the British time. Huge, very huge. And UP is also huge. So Urdu was established by the British in all this huge Hindi-Urdu belt and the Punjab. Schools taught Urdu and also Hindi. Lower courts, police, thana, lower administration, patwari, tehsildar operated in Urdu. Employees were acquainted with the style and technicalities of British Kachahri language. Kachahri, of course, means court. Now, what would happen if this kind of policy was in vogue? Hindi is being taught in schools. Now, you see, Muslims only 14%. Hindi is being taught. So there will be many people who will learn Hindi and come out and they will not get jobs. Okay? Because jobs are in Urdu. So obviously there would be a movement, it's common sense, there would be a movement to replace Urdu. That is what the Hindi movement actually was. And it's just something which was bound to happen because there were more Hindus and because they found that unless they were proficient in Urdu, the highest class was, which was Hindu. They were proficient in Urdu. But then there were many other people also coming up who said this is wrong. You know, it should be the rules should be changed. That is the beginning of the Hindi movement. Let me just tell you about a file which I saw. It was when I was writing my book, Language and Politics in Pakistan. This file was lying in Oxford University archives somewhere. And this was by MacDonald, Lieutenant Governor of UP. And he wrote in it to the Viceroy of that time. He says that, you know, for 3 years people have been petitioning me to allow them to use Hindi when writing letters to the government of India. And I've been refusing them. Now I think this is too much. Justice requires that I should allow them. So I allowed them. I said that if a letter comes to the government in Hindi, in the Devanagari script, it will be replied in the same script, in the same language. If it comes in Hindustani Urdu, then of course we will reply in the same, as this was usual. And the Muslims took up arms and they were very much against it. There was commotion in UP and everybody was very much against this. This is turn of the century period. Why were the Muslims so much against this order? It seems so just. Why were they against it? The Muslims of that period were very much against it. Why? Anyone? Venture a guess, please. My question is, the order which the Lieutenant Governor passed was that if the government receives a letter, it should be answered in the same language and script. But the Muslims are very much against it. Why?
Sir, like I was thinking, I was just making a point. Like by that time, it was a kind of imperialism.
Of
Like
course it was. British imperialism, obviously.
For the sake of showing the other world that we are basically doing good with the Muslims. And in this case, they're just looting the countries.
Oh yes, of course. But economics has nothing to do with this order. Actually, if they had pleased the Hindus, who were more in number, that would be more efficient.
Okay.
So why? Why this order?
I had the same point. Like
No, but why this particular order? Why make a change when people are so much against it? I mean, they want, obviously everyone in government wants least resistance to their policies. This created resistance, so why pass such an order? Well, why were the Muslims against it? That was my original question. Why do you think the Muslims were against such an order? It apparently seems such a just order. Why were they so much against it?
Sir, maybe they not considered the Hindi their own language.
Yes, they wanted Urdu to be used, but the order is actually very modest. If government receives a letter in the Devanagari script in Hindi, government will reply back in the same. That's the order. Nothing more than that. It's not replacing Urdu. Urdu remains the language of the courts till 1949, 2 years after India became free, independent. Well, look at it. Suppose I am an officer and I receive and I have to reply someone in Hindi. So I'll have to hire a clerk who writes Hindi. This clerk will fall ill. So I have to hire another clerk also to write in Hindi. I've got many clerks who are writing in Urdu, but I've got to hire these two. Then these chaps are going to make mistakes. So I've got to hire a supervisor, a head clerk kind of a person to keep an eye upon them. And in the end, the thing should be polished, because after all, it's the Lieutenant Governor's office. Now suppose all over UP you hire so many clerks, etc., every thana, every this, every that, every school. How many clerks? Thousands of clerks. Government doesn't increase budgets. So this is going to come out of those clerks who were otherwise writing in Urdu. That means the class which was benefiting earlier, which meant Muslims, munshis, and the caste class of Hindus, this is going to, some jobs are going to be decreased. So it's a question of bread and butter. That's why they were against it. A small order can change many things. That was the reason. But otherwise, it was justice. Okay. Reformist texts. The British were reformers also. In 1885, Nazir Ahmed's novels had been translated into Bangla. Deputy Nazir Ahmed's novels were very popular. The British loved them. Bengali, Braj Bhasha, Kashmiri, Punjabi, Gujarati, total circulation 40,000 copies. That's a lot in the 19th century. 20 years of publication. Miratul Urus appeared in editions totaling 100,000 copies. And by the way, Miratul Urus is taught even now. Why? Why did this happen? Why, Deputy Nazir Ahmed is a pretty staunch, strict Muslim. And yet, his books were favored by the British so much. The reason is, the British by this time, 19th century, this was the Victorian age in England. So they had become very much puritanical. They did not want erotic, sexual kind of books, poetry or prose to be presented to students. Deputy Nazir Ahmed, etc., did not write sexual poetry or prose. They wrote reformist texts. Get up early in the morning, love your parents and obey the, British government and obey everybody, basically. Be docile, be nice, etc. And stop playing marbles and stuff like that. So who else was with them? The Muslim clergy was with them. The Maulanas were with them. Because the Maulanas were against this kind of poetry anyway. And who else was with them? Sir Sayyid kind of people. The Muslim reformists. In other words, the British lobby was very strong. It had the clergy with it, it had the Muslim reformists with it, and it also had the Hindu reformers with it, because they also did not like erotic texts. That's why this lobby won out. And many of the texts which were taught earlier in India, from medieval days, etc., were simply thrown out because they were considered as obscene, fahish. And actually, if you read them, you will find them fahish also, because you have been brought up by the sensibility of the modern age. So, this is what so a whole sensibility changed, and anti-medieval values were propagated in this. So there was a kind of battle between Urdu and Hindi. And Urdu was very much in demand because it was used in jobs. The Hindi movement created, as I just told you, created a demand for Hindi, but the conditions of the jobs changed only in 1949, so it remained a necessary choice in UP and the Punjab, and some other parts, but mostly here. Kashmir, for instance. In Kashmir, the medium of instruction, the language of the lower courts is still Urdu. And after Persian, it became Urdu. It's still Urdu. As the printing and publication industries were not controlled by government, Hindi increased in publication because that was not controlled by government alone. And in the court, such words are even now used: Gawahan, Bandegan, Sakinan, Dukhtaran, Namaziyan, Pisaran, sons, Warisan, etc. Muwakkil, Vikalatnama, Halafnama, etc. Even now, these words are used in India. Javed Majid wrote about it, Professor Javed Majid, 1995. Pakistan, of course, they're used, but also in India. Private schools of the higher classes open to government inspection. In 1863, the percentage of Urdu ones is 53.13, and the percentage of Hindi is 46.9%. And in 1871, the ratio has changed. It is now Urdu is 60.14%, Hindi is 39.9%. Why? Because more people are going for jobs, and jobs are in Urdu. And this is happening in the UP area. Punjab, let's stay on the UP area for some time. In 1872, 85.90 of the books, monographs, pamphlets, etc. are in Urdu, 14.1% are in Hindi. And in 1934, 13.31 are in Urdu, 86.7 are in Hindi. Complete reversal, because by this time the Hindi movement is strong, and by this time what they've done is that the printing press, etc., is theirs. And they are, of course, Muslims only 14%, so this is happening. Urdu in print, Urdu starts with 90.77%, newspaper, magazine, etc. In 1937, it is 51%. Hindi is nowhere, 9.23%. Punjab Urdu in 1867 is 65.03% share, 18.03 for Hindi, and Gurmukhi is 16.94%. 1916, the data is not there. Newspapers in the Punjab, Urdu 92.31%. In 1880, Hindi is 3.85%. Newspaper, magazine, periodical is all mostly in Urdu. Gurmukhi only 3.85%. 1920, Urdu has decreased, but still 79.46%, and Hindi is 6.70%. Gurmukhi is 13.84%. That has increased. In other words, in Punjab, Urdu dominates. So the reality is, we will conclude soon, even after all this time of trying to make them different languages, politically, socially, culturally, even after 200 years of separation, ordinary spoken Urdu and Hindi are mutually intelligible, which is why, while they are called separate languages officially in both India and Pakistan, everybody in the cities of both countries understands films, dramas and songs in Urdu, Hindi. And that is why you see that what is called Hindi movie is something which you will understand very well. I mean, I'm sure you do. Of course, these are figures of 1948, in which the Hindi one is 147, but even now this continues. So the myths refuted are: Urdu is not a military language, Urdu is not a pidgin language. The ancestor of Urdu Hindi, which was mostly called Hindi, existed in writing at least from the 15th century, if not earlier. And the ancestor of Urdu Hindi was probably the language of the area around Delhi. It was called Khadi Boli. The ancestor of Urdu Hindi was a language of both Hindus and Muslims in the first phase. The British were the greatest promoters of Urdu. The Hindus opposed it from the middle of the 19th century onwards in order to roll back their history of Muslim cultural ascendancy and to find employment in British India at the lower levels. Higher level is, of course, English. So the conclusion is, deconstruction of existing myths in the history of Urdu as taught in South Asia is necessary because these myths create communal antagonism between Hindus and Muslims, and relegates the language to the status of an upstart pidgin. The idea that it's a military language nurtured only in military camps makes it a symbol of Muslim rule for Hindus. In fact, Urdu is a product of the common shared culture of both communities. This is lost in this false association of Urdu with military conquest and the Mughal armies. Locating its birth in the areas now in Pakistan tries to cut it off from the Gangetic Valley, which is its home, and so attenuates the claim of Indian Muslims of its being native to India. Denying the British role in promoting it is false. As for the myth that the Hindus were against it and harmed it, it is untrue for the major part of this language, existence of this language. It is, however, true from the mid-19th century onwards. However, it should be remembered that the imperative to remove the symbols of cultural domination is a well-known phenomenon everywhere. Moreover, since the language of employment at the lower level was Urdu, and the Hindi speakers were more in number than Urdu ones, it was inevitable that the former would try to influence British policy in their favor. Thus, Hindu language policies can be understood in the framework of reversing the colonization of the mind and pragmatic interest. Okay? Thank you very much. I would like to invite questions. First about the lecture, and then general questions about the course.
English or Britishers never harm Urdu. So I was basically reading the English translation of a Quran. There, the person was using "we" for Allah. Then I consult, then they say this is the royal "we," so we can add it. So the person who hasn't any concept of this, so don't we think it would be a perpetual or the permanent harm?
There is not one translation of the Quran. It is in the Quran has been translated numerous times, and hum has been used by Urdu translators also. Hamara hukm, humne hukm diya. It has been used by Urdu translators also. We is not only for plural. We is also for more respect, and it's also for authority. So, and it's one British translator is not British policy as such. There was no policy of, there was no order of how to translate one book or the other. This depended upon whoever was translating it. So this has got nothing to do with British policy as such. British policy overall was varied. There was an overall policy. That was, of course, the consolidation of the empire, to rule the empire. Obviously, they were here to rule. It was obviously a colonization, so they were here to rule. So that was the overall policy. This no British officer could deny. After this policy, there were different ways of doing it. Some officers thought that it was better to befriend the natives of India so that there should not be a revolution against it. Others thought that it is better to be strict, so to show power, because that would deter them from rising in revolt. It was some officers thought that it is just and fair to promote Hindus more because they are more in number. Other officers thought that it is Muslims has been a fighting kind of elite. Therefore, we should not alienate them. We should look after their interest also. So, British officers, if you look at the letters, etc., don't have the same policy. If you say Britain that British policies did harm language, of course they did. Punjabi was harmed. There was no doubt about it, because the language of this area was replaced by Urdu. When the British conquered the Punjab in 1849, they sent letters to different officers, field officers, as to which language they want. I've read those, there were some 300 or so letters, I don't remember how many, but I've read them all. And most of the British officers were prejudiced against Punjabi. They considered this a dialect, inferior, sort of not really a real language, and so on and so forth. 4 officers were against it for officers were against it for political reasons. So probably because of their prejudice, they promoted Urdu, which was they already used it in UP, rather than Punjabi. Punjabi was harmed, but not Urdu. Bengali was not harmed either, because Bengali they used. Sindhi was not harmed either. They created a script for Sindhi, and they used Muslim Sindhi, although there were, of course, Hindus in Sindh also. But the number of Muslim landlords was more, and Muslim landlords were more powerful. So the British used not the Hindu version. There was a Hindu script also. They didn't use that. They used the Muslim script. Reason very simple. The Muslims were landlords. They were more powerful. Why should the British have annoyed the landlords? So there was an overall policy. But otherwise the policy depended upon the officer there and what was happening there. There was no, I have read all the documents available. Your books say that they were anti-Muslim. This is not true. This is only true after 1857 and again true in some parts and in some policies. They were afraid, yes, of Muslim revolt. But that made some officers actually try to please, that some of the officers pleased Muslims more because they were afraid. Yes, there was fear. They did think that there might be a revolt. So in the divide and rule policy was actually implemented in the army. There was, they generally, regiments were mixed. That policy was there. It was that, if it's all Muslim regiment might revolt, so we'll have some Sikhs, we'll have some Hindus, Rajputs and so on and so forth. That policy was there. So there was an overall policy and then there were smaller policies. Gee, any other? But good question.
Sir, I have heard the word Lashkar or Lashkari language for Urdu. Sir, is it the same as Khichdi language?
No. Lashkari means from the army. Lashkar is the army. Khichdi means mixed. The two are different myths which I have just spoken about. For those who want details, you can, if you have time, read this book from Hindi to Urdu. Do you want to talk about other things which are bothering you? Next time, we are going to talk about the phonetics and phonology. First phonetics, then phonology. It won't be tough once you, it becomes simple once I explain to you, hopefully. But
are not familiar.
obviously, you are not familiar, but that is the point of the lecture, etc. And the I will demonstrate from using my mouth. So you will then understand. But I would advise that you read this book first. Don't read the readings which I've given you; they are more complex. Read them later. Readings, the first two, that you can read, but for the you get a bit scared if you start the readings first. So just read this book. It's green in color, and you can see this is how it looks. 2020. Did you like today's lecture? You didn't know all this about Urdu, huh? Well, that is the point of the lecture, to tell you something about an important language which is one of the most frequently used languages in South Asia. Okay, thank you very much.